Hello, my lads and lassies! Today I'm going to tell you a story of one of my ancestors. You see, one of my ancestors was a giantess from Ireland. Don't believe me? You say I'm only 5'8"? Well, listen to the story and then judge. You see, my giantess ancestors married a man named MacCool, and MacCool was one of the mightiest warriors in Ireland, a giant of a man himself, but not quite so clever as his wife, and he knew this, and this is why he married her. So, you see, now MacCool kept his island safe, but on another island, there was the Red Man, another giant named Binadonor, who stomped around his island and was heard to threaten MacCool and his island. Well, MacCool couldn't put up with this, so he shouted and threatened at him across the great strait that stood between their islands, and Binadonor shouted and threatened back at him. So, MacCool decided this couldn't go on, so he began to pick up the largest chunks of rock that he could, and he formed them into great spears and hurled them across the causeway so he could reach his enemy. And by doing this, he built a bridge of rocks, and MacCool moved the rocks further out into the sea and completed his pathway all the way over to challenge Binadonor. And then he discovered exactly how big Binadonor was. As I said, he wasn't quite as clever as his wife, who stayed behind in her house. Binadonor was in fact much larger than MacCool, and MacCool immediately regretted building the causeway. So MacCool spins around and hopes to race back across the causeway he had created unnoticed by the Scottish giant. Unfortunately for Finn, Binadonor was looking for him and spotted him, and so the Scottish giant Binadonor chased MacCool back across the causeway. Finn lost one of his boots, but kept on running. He ran all the way up to his house and told his wife, his clever wife, what had gone on. And she says, "Don't worry, dear, I'll take care of it." She dressed MacCool up in the baby's garments and put him in the cradle. And when Binadonor came pounding on her door, she opened it up politely and said, "Oh, please come in. My husband's not home and I'm just tending the baby." Binadonor was not a complete brute, so he agreed to politely wait for MacCool to come home, since after all his argument was with MacCool. He leaned over the cradle and said what a fine strapping baby it was, and he asked if he could see the baby. And MacCool had begun to sweat with fear, but his wife simply smiled and agreed. And Binadonor reached out his finger to what he thought was the baby, and MacCool reached out and bit his finger. Binadonor gave a howl, and he looked at the huge baby in the cradle, and he looked at the huge wife sitting by the fire, and he decided that if the baby was this big, then MacCool must be even bigger, and he trotted back over the giant's causeway to Scotland. And that is the story of how all of those odd hexagonal pillars came to be buried in the sand at the giant's causeway between Ireland and Scotland. Or so the legend goes. Do you think there might be another explanation, rather than my clever giantess ancestress's boisterous husband?